In this 4-part series, Selling Our Souls, I've been exploring at length some of the moral dilemmas we've been faced with, and why taking some of the hard-line stands could cost us more than we're wagering. We're basically betting our very souls with every opinion, and the odds aren't in our favor, folks. When we wrap up this series, we're moving on to my next episodes, Finding Faith and Deconstructing a Deity, where I'll discuss more my personal journey through faith, how I got where I am today. What were those eye-opening catalyst moments that, pardon the burnout pun, woke me up? Now, I don't like to talk about myself, but I think it's important to share my experiences, our stories, because when I share, I found that it empowers others to also share their stories. Or maybe my story lights the spark of thought that glows into an ember of an idea someday. We talked about cultism and some of the reasons people turn blindly to these ideas and take things way over the line, and how going so far over that line could be your mouth writing a check your soul can't cash. I mean, what makes us go all in when we know damn good and well we don't know nearly enough to feel that confident to bet the house? We're going to discuss more of that later on this season as we deconstruct a culture of cultism. In the previous episodes of Selling Our Souls, this series, I've tried to drive home my point that these issues we're so divided on don't matter as much as we let on. That given the hypocrisy we begin and end each day with, how can we really take ourselves that seriously? When we stand up for some value that may not even be what we truly believe, but we've given into cultism, herded into our either-or pens because we're conditioned to do so. We're worked into a fervor more because we're told we should be angry about this thing, more than the thing itself. This is where we really start getting to the core of our self-loathing. That's right, we usually aren't as angry about the issue as we are angry at ourselves for not doing enough, or maybe doing too much. Up to now, we've discussed our own decision-making and the hypocrisies in choosing our opinions. In next episode's Selling Our Souls finale, I'm giving you the answers to the biggest moral tests we faced in the last couple of generations. But in this penultimate part of Selling Our Souls, I'm exploring the idea that we are the sum of all our parts. And the only reason we believe in the things we do is because someone else told us to. Even if we don't believe them, we are predisposed to our paths because of those people. Imagine if there was a moment in your life that would have flipped the script, where you'd have turned out the photo negative of who you are today. More than we're probably comfortable with comes down to happenstance, generational trauma, and individual trauma. That's right. We're just gooey, jelly-filled meat sacks powered by electricity and trauma. Welcome to the podcast. My journey through deconstructing my spirituality has been painful and uncomfortable, to say the least, and I'm still going through it. It's meant having to look at people I've loved dearly my entire life in a completely different light. I think it's a perpetual process of pursuing perspective and understanding, rather than surrendering to the thinking that one day you might understand if you're really good. To question or not to question, that is the question. When I was a kid, not feeling like I belonged and fit in church, not comprehending the teachings the same way as everyone around me back then seemed to, scrutiny seemed to serve me well. Now, let's be clear that scrutiny in the religious world I remember was as shameful as masturbation. If you asked the wrong question, for which I had a panache, the response could turn into a lecture about doubting Thomas, faith, and how questioning meant you doubted, and if you doubted, you needed to talk to the preacher, and then it's church camp. Needless to say, I've always been overthinking everything, even as a kid in church. I just learned to be more selective to whom I asked my queries. Being the kid who was bullied and rarely had anyone stand up for him. Being the kid with a bigger mouth than he had an ass. Being a kid who, well, that guy that just never really felt like he belonged. I've had to scrutinize almost everything around me. There's a psychology to the bully victim, the survivor, that eventually comes to, how could someone act this way toward another person? Now, that realization isn't really about you, the victim of their rage, but instead that this is part of who they are. They need to victimize others. You were just there. And what God could make someone so broken that they hurt others? Seems like a trauma chain to me, a human trauma centipede, if you will. This morality quandary becomes a big chunk of the deconstruction process. It usually starts with trauma and or pain. Someone we cared about, loved, or respected hurt us or disappointed us. You see, most of this time there's this rose-colored veil in front of our eyes, and we often don't mind everything being a little cloudy because it looks pretty. But when someone, particularly when they profess a faith or spirituality, behaves in ways that contradict those principles, it's going to rattle your sensibilities. Because faith and spirituality is the foundation of most of our principles. Even if you're an atheist, society, it is the basis of our right and wrong. Like I said, even if you're not a believer, these social constructs are bred out of religion. Persecutionism, which is a foundation of American Christianity, this notion that Christ suffered, so what right do you have to complain? Jesus suffered on the cross for you. Stop complaining, or just pick the onion off your burger. But with bullying, especially by someone who professes to be a faith, it's much more jarring spiritually. Things for the victim stop making sense. Is this what being one of them means, or are they just really bad at being one? And if they're this bad at being one, and they're just kids, then imagine how corrupted this must be on an even bigger scale. Overthinking everything. Yeah. So when that string starts getting pulled on, the entire sweater risks unraveling. This is why it's so important to study many religions and doctrines. We'll get into that coming up in the next couple of episodes, but there are some commonalities among all of them. Whether you're a believer or not, even taken as understood philosophy others share. Surely we can admit that there is something about a story that sticks around for hundreds or even thousands of years. By taking a step back from your own beliefs, you'll begin to see that the major religions of the world are all on the same page about a lot of stuff. You see, that scrutiny solidified my spirituality, even if it annihilated my religion. Individually, of course. This is why they don't want us going off to college. College for me was eye-opening. I'd been on this journey through my culty culture for most of my prissy childhood. I wasn't like most kids I grew up around. But when I found college, I found diversity. Even in my very white little echo bubble, there was more diversity to that white than I'd ever encountered back in Nothingtown, USA. And more diversity, period, of people, of ideas. And I started seeing that things weren't always what I was told. For example, I was always told that being gay would make you depressed and miserable. What they didn't tell me was that it was from the bullying of people who wouldn't accept you for who you are and used make-believe fairy tales to justify their hate. You see, it's the fine print. I began to see more clearly that there were groups of people that, whether I fit in or not, they accepted me. And of course some didn't, but I just knew I'd found a different way of being than back home. Now understand, I went to school 2.5 hours away from home, if that, just to another part of the same state that looked a lot like pretty much everywhere else I'd ever been. Nothing really fancy. I just knew I didn't want to be certain things from back home, even though I was, just in a much less hateful but still just as toxic, even if you say it with a smile kind of way. I was coming out of toxic white Southern culture. I had all of these new options for friends and ideas and what was acceptable and normal. I was meeting people so different than back home. And that made me question things I'd never thought I'd question. I started to see that some things just weren't what I was always told. Since I was young, I've had to scrutinize everything from friends and family to proper fried chicken to biscuits and gravy, from fealty to a Confederate flag to a love of fishing, hunting, four-wheeling, NASCAR, and blind loyalty to the football team of a college somebody wasn't smart enough to even get into. It's these weird, seemingly cultural cornerstones of my heritage. None of them were for me. I never fit into any of it. Except fried chicken. But the notion of watching cars go in circles and circles and who drove what was foreign to me. I have no problem telling you the names of most of the Tennessee Titans players, don't get me wrong, but I just was never really an outdoorsy person, and that made me scrutinize what it meant for me to be a man. And wait till I get to the episode where I overthink masculinity. I've had to scrutinize this weird obsession with being a loser that is the Confederate flag. My whole life, seeing people cling to that more than their American flag, as sacred as their Bible. I know how that sounds, but it's long overdue to be said, and I hate to be the one to say it. Okay, no, I don't. Let's not lie to each other. But we've got to start having these conversations because we have to be careful of cultism. And that's something my culture is very susceptible to. That and ending sentences on a preposition. My culture is so into cults, but also so racist that the cult we decided to follow as a civilization wasn't good enough because it was headed by a Middle Eastern brown Jew. So we renaissanced him up and gave old Sonny a whitewash. That's what I'm talking about. How many kids grow up thinking that Jesus looked like the paintings commissioned by racist kings and popes? Don't get me started on Magdalene. Every televangelist you've ever heard is a cultist. Robertson, Osteen, Falwell, Sr. and Jr. Graham, certainly the latter, but the former as well. And on to today's big-name hate preachers like Kenneth Copeland, Greg Locke, and the white nationalist churches popping up everywhere. Domestic terror threats get asked to leave a good church or choose to because that commie preacher is preaching too much love and not enough lynching. I might argue that the moment you sell out your convictions to worship on television in a public forum, you've jumped the spiritual shark, Father Fonzie. I know. It's the best way to reach people, to reach the masses and those who can't get out, the homebound. But I default to religion and faith being extremely private and intimate. My interpretations of how we're instructed to worship, pray, and regard our Maker are a bit extreme, different, for sure. And that's why I keep it to myself. I get that not everybody sees it my way, so I don't judge, just to acknowledge that praying in the Cracker Barrel, in the football stands, and on a TV show, it's fake. There may be a part of it, a tiny part that may be genuine, but for me, that genuine prayer is sort of shadowed by the, hey, look at me-ness of it all. It's showboating. Plus, I've never really gotten down with the whole bow your heads when one guy prays and you just toss your energy that way, right, towards whatever he's saying. No, that's a lot of what got us here. Some call that public display of spiritual affection setting a spiritual example, and I get that, but careful. Again, we have to be wary of our butterfly effects. The ripple effects of our actions aren't always positive. Our souls are at stake, remember? Mind one's business is always the safest bet after all, right? I mean, we can help someone without converting and indoctrinating them, right? This is why I'm always suspicious when someone makes which fairy tale they believe in such a big deal. They're trying to sell you on something. And it's almost always on the validation they need that theirs is real. You see, if you believe in what they're telling you, they don't feel as ridiculous. Cultism. Ultimately, in America, our politics, our religion, at least Christianity, are intertwined and have sort of grown these entangled roots under the surface of our society that we just can't dig past. I know, I sound hypercritical of religion and Southern or white culture. let me put you at ease. It's only because I am. Because of that ripple effect, the butterfly effect of our actions and what we're willing to allow, and the understanding of how big picture unimportant my hardline stance might be, and the understanding that far too often, far too many people push far too hard for their way or the highway when they are far too misinformed on far too few of the facts. I've seen generations get raised with this sort of demonization of education and a turning up at the nose of rising above one's raising. Now, not everybody I knew was like this. There was also this blind following without questioning. Now, again, if I sound hypercritical, it's because if you're raised with a limited perspective or not embracing of other ideas, that is bigotry. That is the path to ignorance and isms. If we never open up our mind to new ideas, other ways of thinking, perhaps even different ways of looking at things we've already convinced ourselves we're sure of, how will we ever grow? Especially if we're already born into a mindset we're told is wrong to question. How will we ever overcome our biases? I had a knack for patterns. Always have. Word searches, Where's Waldo, Bernie memes. I've just always had a knack for sort of unfocusing or refocusing my eyes a little and the answers just pop out. Like Ethan Suplee staring at the boat in the mall, but successful. So when I stumbled into a radio career, I found that there was a pattern-like science to music scheduling that I naturally took to and understood. My brain just worked that way. I enjoyed tweaking the balance of my playlist as a radio programmer. I never even knew that job title existed. Pure luck, I tell you. How I came across the career path that would define the first half of my life. I almost went down a completely different path because, see, none of it matters. It was a series of little events that led up to that life path. A slight change from just one of those details, and I'd have veered somewhere else. God's plan or simple circumstantial coincidence, the argument holds. It's either ultimately in the hands of God, controlling our destiny, so what does it matter? Or it's just really luck. So what does it matter? I got a job in a career field I had never considered. I wasn't a radio geek or even a music geek. And the thing is, relating to my point about culture, I hated country music. I didn't like the country mentality or Southern culture growing up. I saw them as hicks who enjoyed being hicks. I worked very hard at washing my accent and overcompensating it. I ended up having a decently respectable career programming mostly country radio stations in towns I'd lived my entire life trying not to live in, playing music I spent my entire life trying to avoid, for people I tried my whole life trying to get away from, working for people who couldn't have cared less about me as a human being, and turned out were exactly the kinds of people I should have known to avoid from the very start. Now, I'm not ungrateful, just a realist who isn't into whitewashing his own history and living through the lens of rose-colored glasses. If you wanted me to say nicer things, you should have concerned yourself with being nicer. One thing about country music. The country audience is very loyal and diverse. Certainly not in ethnicity so much as range of incomes of white people. Because the music is relatable and sometimes good. And with my first radio gig, I had to take over the morning show of this little station in one of those small racist towns I grew up in. Now, I had no idea about country music until I turned it on and listened. And then I caught myself singing along to 40 Hour Week and Oceanfront Property and Conway Twitty, and I realized this was the soundtrack to my childhood, whether I liked it or not. This music I always hated because of the cultural shortcomings and ignorance it represented, to me anyway. It was rich, meaningful, and beautiful. However, growing up in that culture, I had discovered early on that there was a darkness and toxicity I recognized in people, but I couldn't identify. Until now. It clouded my judgment on the music of this culture. I knew the songs, and I really enjoyed them. They'd been the background music for almost every memory. And then I had a career in radio, meeting lovely and wonderful people, human beings who were sweet and genuine and often stereotypical, but sort of in spite of themselves. This was a culture that was a fragment of my being, a fragment I often wanted to distance myself from, but a significant portion of my life. I would have never come to terms with that the way I have had I remained closed off to the idea of country music. I would have never seen the things I've seen that led me where I am today. So I think I get Hillbilly Elegy. As I said before, this is not my Hillbilly Elegy, this is my Hillbilly eulogy. J.D. Vance is a terrible human being. He wrote the book. Now, I can say that Vance and I are very similar in some ways, in ways I'm not comfortable. We both looked down on the deplorable and dead-end places we grew up and worked our butts off to leave them behind. He wrote a book. I'm writing a book. Man, you lost it. You had it, man. You were really there. I would have never seen the things I've seen that led me where I am today. So I think I get Hillbilly Elegy. And I've said it before, all of this is not my Hillbilly Elegy. This is my Hillbilly eulogy. J.D. Vance is a terrible human being. He wrote the book. Now, I can say that Vance and I are very similar in ways I'm not comfortable. We both looked down on the deplorable and dead-end places we grew up and worked our butts off to leave them behind. He wrote a book, I'm writing a book. And mine may get some of the same criticisms he did. Many felt that his perspective on these places and this culture was skewed with a negative bias, that because he left there so young, what right does he have to do this expose on what I call toxic white Southern culture? Like a Christmas Easter Catholic writing a tell-all book about Catholic culture. While J.D. Vance and the things he believes in I find highly offensive, the movie at least doesn't really bother me or offend me at all, except that it was too nice and too polite about a very real problem. I didn't read the book, and I find Vance so detestable I don't know that I would outside of research, but I did watch the movie because Miss Glenn Close, please. It was pretty reflective of the culture that I remember. But then again, my perspective of that culture seems to be pretty similar to Vance's on some levels. The difference is, I openly condemn them and call them out, and he panders to them for votes. Maybe I'm doing this wrong. I didn't grow up on Skinner and Seeger, okay? I'm sure my dad knew the songs, knew the music. I just never really knew him to be into it. Dad was John Wayne, Clint Eastwood, Charles Bronson, Merle Haggard, Johnny Cash, and Conway Twitty. The flavor profile for my father wasn't the least bit diverse. However, one of his favorite comedians was Red Fox. But I think because the man was filthy and either validated my dad's humor or influenced his sense of humor, one or the other. The black entertainment that we watched, things like Sanford and Son, Good Times, The Jeffersons, reinforced a lot of stereotypes. My dad, a traveled man who used those travels and experiences to justify his bigotry, also had the Roots series on VHS, and he'd watch it anytime it was on television. Now, how does a man watch Roots and still tell insensitive jokes, much less use that word? That local radio station I ended up working for my first job, the country station I'm talking about? Well, when Dad was a kid, that town's AM station probably played country music. So Dad grew up with it. He became a country music fan. Dad liked country redneck hillbilly humor. Beverly Hillbillies, Sandy Griffith, Gomer Pyle, Jerry Clower. How? Dad was a scrappy country boy survivor. His life influenced early by tragedy and struggle. Today, his parents would be financially ruined by the fireworks accident that took my dad's right eye when he was 14 years old. Back then, we basically had socialized medicine, you see. So the main struggle wasn't bankruptcy and poverty, but instead trying to live life adjusting with this glass eye. having that be the thing people take away when they meet you, not being taken seriously. I mean, it's either a conversation you have or you don't, and you let them assume. And so that trauma certainly affected my dad. His temperament was probably molded out of the bullying and the whispers he experienced. Maybe an inferiority complex and subsequent chip on his shoulder over being kept from football or military service. Maybe he didn't feel as much like a man. It certainly affected his patience threshold. Maybe it affected how he perceived women, since it's likely attracting girls with a glass eye was challenging. And imagine walking into a job interview with this glass eye that never seems to be right on with the real eye. You bet that trauma affected my dad, molded the way he saw the world, and impacted the justice he felt he was given in various situations. My dad's life and how he saw the world, his opinions and ideas, the things he was interested in and the things I would be influenced by. All due to one Saturday afternoon in 1956, one firecracker, and a glass eye. Well, because I love myself a good multi-layered metaphor, we all have a glass eye, both the event that altered the course of our lives forever and set us on our path, but also a glass eye in that thing that holds us back or defines us, hinders us, makes or breaks us, the catalyst for our trauma, the struggle, the hurdle, even privileged people. Sometimes it's crushing anxiety. Sometimes a reputation you just can't shake. Sometimes it's a family name, the albatross around our necks. It's different for us all, but still the same. Mine has been toxic white Southern culture. For a kid who never felt like he belonged, that was the hand I was dealt. I made a life fighting against the culture in which I was raised, and then I took a career immersed in that culture. And even though I didn't like some of his attitudes, I did that in part to make my dad proud. And proud he was. I bring my father's story up because so many of our dads are like my dad. Moms too, grandparents, products of their own environment, the sum of all their parts, even the unpleasant ones. My dad, with what I just told you, should have known struggle. He was a history buff. He taught me about the dark aspects of our nation's history and the Civil War. He watched Roots, and yet he was pretty free with the jokes. And because he was influenced more by country music during his life, it wasn't until I was an adult, working in classic rock radio, when someone told me that Geddy Lee was a man. That was an embarrassing moment live on the air. My path was influenced not by my own exploration of the world and what it had to offer, but limited to just the experiences of those around me. As in, my dad was country, not rock. That path was laid out early for me. I was predisposed to it. My vision of the world was narrowed into a tunnel due to where I grew up, how I grew up, with whom I grew up. By the time it came to make my own decisions, I had been denied most of the data that would have helped make better choices. Just as my father's rebellion for anything related to his father's path influenced his path, my dad was on my dad's path influenced my own path. And I'm sure you can say the same about something in your own life. Maybe you can think of these moments in your life where things could have gone drastically different if you hadn't made the decision someone else wanted you to make, or someone else made for you. When we discuss a person's personal journey, think of it like taking an underground tunnel versus the path above ground through nature. You get to the same place, but the tunnel only has a limited perspective, darkness, and not much to take in, just light at the end of the tunnel, not thinking about much else but the journey. Whereas if you take the path through nature, you get to see how the world works. You still get where you're going, maybe not as fast, but you see so much more. My dad was a tunnel vision guy. I think he thought he wasn't. My dad lived life doing things his own way, breaking the mold, but he still succumbed to the same narrow mentality cultisms to which his parents adhered. No stick in the mud for this fellow. Just as my dad was a step of ideological autonomy away from his father, I'm stepping out of that generational indoctrination way of thinking even more. See, this old dog learned some new tricks, folks. I threw the horse blinders off. Ooh, one more cliche and I've got a bingo. In our culture, it isn't just a stereotype of one specific Christian denomination, it's just what we do. We look both ways. Not before we cross the street, before we tell a tasteless joke or a shitty comment. Why? Because we lack values. We don't even have the integrity to say the thing boldly and loudly. Well, in fairness, a lot of people do now, but we look both ways to make sure one of them isn't around, not because we're trying to be sensitive to them, but because we don't want to get called out. Because we know it's wrong. Each and every one of us knows it's wrong. Even if we belligerently believe it shouldn't be wrong, we know that it's wrong. We always have. So we look. We check first, because if we were really so concerned with being insensitive, we wouldn't have said the thing to begin with. My dad, by the way, was not one to really look over his shoulder first. Funny guy. Tacky, though. Whether it's children in cages, the reality that guns cause death, wearing your damn mask, ditching our kids at daycare, war in Ukraine, or telling an offensive joke, we stop where we want in the logic chain. Going further risks blowing up our worlds, making us care too much, making us take a look inward. We mute the commercials because constantly seeing the kids with clefts and Sarah McLachlan's dogs weighs too much on us. It reminds us that we still have money in the bank and we can help. We just choose not to. Yeah, but we don't think about it because we don't want to think about it. Admit that. Because we're crossing a social boundary that's going to be hard to come back from. Atheists aside, and don't worry, you're free to spectate at this socio-political shit show of reasoning. Assuming we believe in a higher power that guides us, and a higher set of principles and morals that are defined deeper than by County Statute 1A Part III, our eternal souls, hypothetically, would be forever in this ledger, balancing between red and black, balancing the scales of our existence, right? How much we leave versus how much we take. Our footprint, the cost-benefit of our being here. Because despite your personal definition of God and how you perceive him or her or them or it, the idea that you have a purpose on this earth, an obligation to leave it better than it was before you got here, is the way we honor the one true God, whichever one of the over 2,000 it may or may not even be. Living our lives, the one we get, if we assume that too for a moment, living that gift of experiencing this reality, this world, the absolute least we can do is make sure the after effects of our being here aren't outweighed by the damage we did while we were here. If you've raised a child, you know exactly the obligation I'm talking about. This burden of raising a successful human being, a good person. Sending someone out in the world who will do good for others. And when sometimes our kids end up being an asshole, well, again, mirrors. You know, you see the parents of the Capitol insurrection traitors on TV, mass murderers, you see their parents on TV. It's heartbreaking because all you want is to put positivity out in the world, right? And here are these parents who are asked about how they could raise monsters. What does it matter in the grand scheme of things? You know, people disown their child because of whom the child loves, and that pain is immeasurable. The pain it causes the hater and the victim, the pain of those affected by it. All because of what? This magic 2,000-year-old sky wizard who died telling people that he loved them unconditionally and they needed to love each other unconditionally was suddenly just going to look at this person and say, ew, not like that. Now, what a gamble on one's soul. Mama and Daddy are betting God will appreciate their adherence to a misinterpreted, obscure Old Testament passage over the actual teachings of Jesus Christ, but will violate their own logic explaining why that same passage is the old law as they stuff their bacon-wrapped shrimp down their gullets. All you can eat shrimp, only at Red Lobster for a limited time. I'm willing to bet that in everything each and every one of us espouse to be true, even the really offensive statements I've made in this episode, they're steeped in a toxic, limited, and jaded perspective. One that's rooted in psychological trauma. In our next few episodes of this season, I'll be deconstructing my own journey through politics and religion. I'll talk about what led me to the Republican Party as a young voter. I'll talk about what drove me away from it. Next, the final episode of Selling Our Souls, then Finding Faith and Deconstructing a Deity, where I'll delve into my spiritual journey as well. What I hope to uncover is some universal relatability between us all. How my journey out of conservatism and my evolution as a sort of smorgasbord Judeo-Christian has allowed for this perspective of our problems our society is facing right now and how we can solve them, working together, united. How the little hypocrisies, these moral compromises we've been talking about, are costing us our immortal soul. How we're dumbing down our minds and numbing down our hearts as a society. Then, later this season, I'm shifting gears to some inspirational self-help as we're going to attempt to solve for X in the human mathematical equation. We've been peeling back the layers of this onion all season long to answer these hard questions. Why are we the way we are? And what is it costing us? Why are some people so susceptible to cultism and others less so? We'll look at how we react to negative people and events in our lives and why. We'll look at why we are those negative people and why we create those negative events for other people. We're going to discuss further this evolution out of our own toxicities and how we can be better individuals and leave a cleaner footprint when we're gone. This isn't easy, but it's important. These aren't going to be easy conversations. And I'm willing to get a few snarky comments because I'm still working through a lot of my toxicity against my own people. But this is a social evolution. Or devolution. The choice is up to we, the species. This is the eternal battle for our eternal soul. Coming up, we're sending off this Selling Our Souls series with part 4, where I'm giving you the answers to the test, folks. That's right, I'm sneaking into the teacher's desk during study hall and stealing the answer key for the biggest moral dilemmas of our generations. I feel like humanity is adrift, untethered in these choppy and murky waters of ethics and morality. Just like in this episode, I laid out a little of my experience to display how some people never get the eye-opening diversity experience I discussed about going off to college, and how that questioning can be served to reinforce your beliefs or deconstruct, depending on how firm you are in your beliefs. Also, continuing down the theme of how important are your opinions really if it means we're selling our souls, I showed how easily I could have been anything but what I ended up, and how it's more the influence of others around us for why we do what we do, more than us choosing our own paths. This is also how we choose our opinions. They're all influenced by others, and we're betting our souls on these opinion hills we choose to climb. What if the only reason you believe that is because your parents did? Well, who told them to believe it? All of this is leading us straight to falling into cultism. As I unwind my philosophies, my findings, and my journey through various aspects of my life during this season of Overthinking Everything, I also feel like we were given the answers to the test. In Selling Our Souls Part 4 and into the next episodes, Finding Faith and Deconstructing a Deity, I'll share more personal stories, but I'll also connect those dots to the greatest moral and spiritual tests we faced in recent years. Lots of big moments where I feel like whatever higher power was presenting a choose-your-own-adventure book of underhanded slow pitches straight over the center of the plate, and we'd rather just charge the mound and beat the pitcher for existing than just swing the bat and play ball? We've been tested repeatedly over the years, and folks, we have failed. But never fear, I have the answer key, and I'll discuss that in the next few episodes as I deconstruct a culture of cultism. Thanks for joining me. Check out some of my other videos on YouTube. I've got all my music, all my podcasts, all my TikToks set up in original playlists for you. Follow me on TikTok. I'm Josh Brandon VO, Josh Brandon VO 2.0. Like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Help me grow. Do all the things I need you to do. And if you really like this series, consider a donation to Cash App or subscribe on Patreon. I'm Josh Brandon, and I'm overthinking everything.